Evaluation for Gender Empowerment, Women in the Labor Market in Pakistan. We're joined by three esteemed panelists, and I'm going to introduce them. Dr. Shabnam is the Global Director for Gender and Health and Deputy Executive Director at Women in Global Health, overseeing the 47 chapters operating across 43 countries. As a co-founder of Women in Global Health Pakistan, she had brought together 900 women leaders to advance the gender transformative leadership agenda. She's a seasoned development professional and with over 15 years of experience in leadership positions, CSL positions at the Planning Commission, led Pakistan's national COVID-19 response effort, and led Pakistan's voluntary national review. She has successfully managed large-scale and high-impact project portfolios, led multidisciplinary and cross-cultural teams, and collaborated effectively with institutions internationally. Welcome, Dr. Shabnam. Dr. Kate Vyborny is an Associate Director of the Dev Lab at Duke University and Research Scientist at the Department of Economics at Duke University. She completed her PhD in Department of Economics at the University of Oxford, where she was affiliated with the Center for the Study of African Economies. Additionally, she holds visiting faculty positions at the Lahore School of Economics and the Lahore University of Management Sciences. She is also a fellow of the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan, CERP, and the Consortium for Development Policy Research in Pakistan, CDPR. Welcome, Dr. Kate. Dr. Hadia is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Economics at LUMS and co-director of GenTech. Her research agenda considers the impact of monetary and public resource constraints on individuals in Pakistan, with a special focus on women's access to decent and empowering work. She has published in international journals and is currently editing a book titled Gender at Work in Pakistan. She's a Fulbright scholar and has a PhD from the Ohio State University and an MSc from the University of Warwick. Thank you so much, Dr. Hadia, for joining us. I'll start off the discussion by, and this question is for all three panelists, if you can very briefly highlight your work and particularly look at how your work looks at gender empowerment in the Pakistani context. Dr. Shabnam, maybe you can start.
Thank you so much, Lala. Very pleased to be with you here all today. So I've had the privilege of leading the gender portfolio at the Planning Commission, and where I was responsible for the entire social sector within the portfolio that I was leading. So gender is cross-cutting, and when I inherited the portfolio, I felt it was too broad, having health, education, manpower development, skill development, SDGs, youth. But I think that provided me with an opportunity to look across all these sectors from a gender lens and try to integrate and mainstream gender across. So I led the National Gender Policy Framework for Pakistan, which was launched on the International Women's Day 2022. And as I was the focal lead for the youth program for the Planning Commission. So I was also looking at the empowerment from the gender lens, that how the skill development program or the loans which we were to give under those programs could be facilitated both at the planning phase, the monitoring phase, as well as troubleshooting if we were not able to meet the targets of providing them over. At the Planning Commission, I was able to use the statistics because the Bureau of Statistics works very closely to us. So we were able to generate gender disaggregated dashboards for each and every district of the country, which showed that where our labor force participation was in terms of females as per their age and in each of the districts. So providing the baselines for any sort of planning or programming by the government or the development partners. So I'll just pause here.
Thank you so much for that. For all the attendees, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature in the webinar, and we'll address your questions in the last 15 minutes. Yes, Dr. Hadia, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Lara Rukh, and thank you for organizing this fantastic panel. I'm very excited to be here with Kate and Shabnam. I work, like you briefly pointed out, I work on women's labor markets. I look at the barriers more so than the opportunities, perhaps. Part of that has to do with a very low labor force participation rate. I'm interested in informal markets, and I'm really interested in the levers that we need to pull in order to really get more women into the labor market. My interest in this comes from the key link that we know exists between women's access to monetary resources and the impact that this has on their status within the household, the kind of decision-making that they make. So while working on labor markets in general, I've also done evaluations of cash transfer programs on women's decision-making, on their autonomy. A major strand of my work these days is actually looking at how we can leverage technology in order to improve women's access to work, in order to increase their earning opportunities. And it's been one thing that I'm really interested in is the kind of barriers that women face when it comes to accessing digital platforms and digital technologies. And I'm also really interested in figuring out the solutions that women have brought to bear. So I work a lot with low literate, low income populations and the innovative ways that they're using technology, which hasn't been designed for their particular group, for their particular class, how they're able to still pivot and use technologies in order to realize agency, perhaps in very limited forms, in very limited expressions, but sort of really see how women are deploying homegrown solutions in order to improve their economic circumstances.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hadia. Dr. Kate, you want to go on next?
Sorry, rookie error, I was muted. Thank you so much to the organizers to SERP and the other organizers for doing this panel. I'm really excited to join this conversation. So I work with the Duke Dev Lab primarily in Pakistan and in collaboration with SERP on impact evaluation on different public policy issues with a big focus on gender, including the Women's Mobility Program that Lala Rukh is involved in and mentioned a minute ago. So broadly speaking, what that means is that we work with partners, including government and non-government partners, and also on standalone research projects, trying to test out innovative solutions, policies, and programs that can be used to help enhance women's empowerment in different domains. So for example, we have one project that looks at how providing safe transport to work might increase women's economic participation. We have a different project that looks at women's access to their share of inheritance. So across many different scopes, across many different spheres of life, what kind of interventions can be used to help enhance women's empowerment? And so we use randomized control trials and observational studies using large quantitative surveys to try to generate new evidence to study what works most effectively and try to inform policies going forward. Really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Kate. So moving on, and I think because both Dr. Hadia and Dr. Kate are particularly involved in research studies, looking at how women's participation can increase in the labor market. So my question is mostly directed to them. What are aspects that you think researchers should keep in mind when they're designing studies, particularly when they focus on populations, women populations, and when they're focusing on gender as an outcome? Dr. Hadia, if you want to go ahead first.
Sure. So that's a really tough question, actually. And I think it's a tough question. And it's a really interesting question, particularly for economists. And so I would be really interested in hearing Kate's take on this as well. One thing that as a researcher, I think we all have to be really careful about is you can't just add gender and stir. So it can't just be that if you want to think about designing a survey or you want to look at gendered aspects, you think that, oh, I'll just ask a question which tells me the gender of the respondent, and that's enough. That's all I really need to think about. So if we really want to get to the structural barriers that women face, and I think we really need to do a concerted effort to try and understand the gender order. And the sex of the respondent plays a part in there, yes. And in this, I think we also have to be really careful that gender is not just men or women, right? In the sense that I think it's not enough to just think about whether the respondent is a woman or whether the respondent is a man. I think we really need to get to what are the implicit and explicit biases, for example, that they face. So you need to really think about the series of questions that you're designing. So if you want to get to, let's say, what are the structural barriers that exist within the labor market, or what are the type of discrimination that people face? We know that women face discrimination, but there's discrimination that men face as well. So the kind of questions that we're designing really have to keep those nuances in mind. One, that's the first thing that I wanted to say. And I think it is also important to keep the method that you're deploying flexible. So as a researcher who works on gender, you have to keep an open mind that in some situations, the kind of research questions that you're asking for those RCTs will work really well, or your typical quantitative surveys are going to work really well. But for other, in order to get to the nuances, you might need to do some focus groups, you might need to do some in-depth conversations. Perhaps when it comes to questions of gender, or even when you're working with other vulnerable or marginalized populations, you really have to keep an open mind about mixed methods. And you might need to pick and choose which method you're deploying for certain types of research questions. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much. So just I think what I'm going to say kind of complements what Hadia has shared. So one thing I wanted to highlight for researchers and M&E professionals thinking about these issues is the problem of social desirability bias. So what do I mean by that? I mean that when we ask someone, for example, who gets to decide, how the money is spent on groceries in your house, what's determining what she answers? Obviously, there's some true answer to that question that about what happens in practice, but then there's also another layer, which is, how do I feel about being surveyed? How do I feel about you as an interviewer asking me this, and how do I want to represent myself or my family? And so that means that what I say might differ a little bit from what happens in practice. What's interesting about that is that when we think about, especially in a pretty conservative cultural context, the direction of social desirability bias isn't obvious. It might be that women respondents in a survey wish to portray themselves as being more empowered, or on the other hand, they might wish to show that they're kind of conforming to what people expect around them in their context. And so it's not obvious whether their answer will be kind of more or less than the true answer that you're looking for, in a sense. So the other important thing to keep in mind, especially when we're evaluating the impact of programs or interventions, is that the intervention itself can have an impact on that bias. So it could be, for example, that, and this is something that's very well documented in the space of intimate partner violence, many kinds of interventions to target reducing intimate partner violence also make people more comfortable telling about intimate partner violence in a survey. And so what that means is you might have an intervention that reduces that violence, which would be a great success, but actually in the study, it ends up looking like it increased the violence because it made people more comfortable telling about it in the survey. So that puts us in a really difficult position when it comes to measuring these kinds of outcomes. What can we do about it? Well, I would say there's kind of two broad things we can think about, two sort of broad things we can think about doing. The first is to think carefully about the environment of surveys. So there can be a huge difference in how people answer surveys depending on whether they answer in their doctor's office, in their home, in their workplace. The exact same person, exact same interview, but where they are and who they think might be overhearing them matters a lot. one innovative approach that a number of researchers have started to use in recent years to overcome this in the case of sensitive questions like violence is to use audio computer-assisted self-interviewing, so ACASI. So what that means is instead of an interviewer asking me questions and I answer out loud, I hear the questions on a headset and I answer the questions on a tablet. And so that means that my husband doesn't overhear me, the question, he doesn't overhear my answer. And so I might feel that there's kind of evidence about that suggests that that people feel more comfortable reporting higher rates of violence in that kind of using that kind of a tool. It's not a settled best method yet. There's still an active set of studies trying to understand whether this is the optimal way to do it, but it seems really promising. So one is pay attention to the environment of the interview. Two is try to use innovative measures that observe people's real choices as opposed to their self-report. So like a simple version of this is to ask people about concrete decisions that happened as opposed to a general perception. That can get you a lot of the way. There's other things that we can do to take this further, like offering people the opportunity to apply for a job or to come in person for a work day or a training and see whether, if we want to see kind of whether they're able to, whether they're interested in working or whether they're able to get permission from their families to go, then actually offering them a small opportunity to do so and seeing whether or not they participate is a good way to do that. So that's a part of what we do in the Women's Mobility and Job Talash program at SERP. We have a similar project looking at local support organizations with PPAF across Pakistan, in which in our Endline survey, we included a grant workshop for the organizations. So that gives them something really useful, and it's a real task with a real outcome for them, like they're going to write a proposal. But it means we can also observe, do the women actually, they tell us that there are women in their organization. Do the women actually show up, and do they talk, and did their ideas get incorporated into the proposal that they write? So that helps us to overcome desirability bias, because now it's a higher stakes thing. It's not just telling the interviewer that yes, the women participate. It's actually seeing the women participate in something with a bit higher stakes. So these are kind of, depending on the thing that you're evaluating, which of these sorts of tools might be useful could vary a lot. But I think there's a lot of really interesting ideas and a growing toolkit to kind of get around some of these issues. And it's something to think about at the inception of a project.
That's very helpful. Yes, Dr. Shamli, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think a lot has been said, and I would just want to bring in a policy perspective, because gender is a very important subject. Half of our population are females, and we are a very large country, and recent census shows that we've grown even beyond what we had estimated onto. Choosing the research topic is something that I just wanted to highlight, because despite being at the senior most policy position, there was hardly any evidence that would come to us from the academic institutions or research institutions. So that nexus needs to be strengthened, I feel. So because the research that we are conducting, and we have very, very competent people, very skilled people who are there in the research academic institutions, but first doing research on a subject which is a policy matter, and then communicating the results in a way which sensitize the policy and decision makers, and creating a compelling case around the decision making that happens in the policy rooms. I feel that we have a broken link there. So whereas this evidence and these research studies do get published, maybe getting published into highest impact papers, but we don't see any change happening at the program and policy level. So I think the utilization of this evidence is something that we need to really see, that how we may be able to bring about a change and align it to some of the policy questions which are being debated on the policy tables.
Thank you so much for that. Actually related to this, Kate had a question about so you mentioned that there are policy aspects where you feel that you don't have enough evidence or research for that. So can you give examples about arenas or topics that you felt that where there was not enough evidence
Okay.
or enough research?
So just to give you an example of, the domain that I'm currently looking at, which is the gendered health workforce issue. So globally, 70% of the health workforce is females. In Pakistan, it is even more than 70% because we have 100% of our community health workers as females, 92% of nurses are females, and 70% of girls in medical dental schools are females. However, when we look at the labor market, there's a high turnover that we see, and there's an exit of qualified workforce, which is critical for us for achieving our universal health coverage, and we cannot afford to lose that workforce. However, the understanding behind the exit of this health workforce is not there. So the reasons which are making these competent, skilled, workers leave the health workforce, and if that research is happening, then bringing it to the policy tables and raising awareness around what policy measures need to be put into place. We do talk about gender equality, and I think even the notion of gender equality is not well understood. We feel that just putting on our adverts that this position is open to both male and females, I think it's important for us to also do a research on what is the understanding of employees when they say that we are gender equal and we encourage women to apply. So it is very important for us to understand first and then improve that understanding through some advocacy measures and through some policy measures so that we are able to bring that change. So we don't see those sorts of research around factors which are restricting the women from participating in the labor market, despite being we see a very high number of women. We've almost closed our education gap, the gender gap at the tertiary level. But still, we see only 22% of the women in the labor market. What is the gender pay gap over there? So these are some of the very critical policy questions which need to be answered. And I think the research institutions, the policy institutions can play a very critical role because that expertise is not available within the government institutions where these decisions are taken.
Absolutely. So I see a raised hand. Can we take questions at the end? So we have reserved 15 minutes at the end for questions. So we'll take questions towards the end. You can also write your question in the Q&A and we'll address it towards the end of the session. So I think, I think from all three panelists, we get a sense that studying questions of gender are particularly complicated. And this is because, like, for example, the context that we're operating in Pakistan, it's a very deeply patriarchal society, and a lot of the fields of health, education, labor markets, they're very deeply entrenched in social norms. So simply having a policy intervention or a research intervention that tackles one of these sectors is sometimes not enough. So in this context, I want to ask all the panelists, how effective do you think are interventions that aim to increase women's participation, given that a lot of these things are very deeply entrenched in societal norms and how the family, for example, perceives or how the family allows a woman to leave the house, etc. Dr. Hadia, do you want to go first?
Sure. So, I mean, norms are changing, and there's some really interesting work that looks at the connection between labor force participation and norms. And the thing is, it works both ways. So as norms change, labor force participation rates change. As labor force participation rates change, norms change. And there is evidence to suggest even in a conservative setting like ours, where where gender roles and norms around gender roles are quite strictly defined, you have seen changes, and we can see them quite anecdotally, at least we can see them in our urban setting. So I think Punjab is a great example of this, because urbanization in Punjab has been changing massively. And as urbanization changes, as your income structures change, as family structures change, you do see changes in roles. Now, these changes in roles aren't that stark and they're not that quick, but if you start tracing them, if you start looking at trends, then there are differences. Now, one of the major issues when it comes to labor force participation rates, for example, is when you start plotting women's formal labor force participation rates, they're flat in Pakistan. They're pretty much flat. Now, there's certain nuances to this which we don't capture, and I think that's where the intervention becomes. It really makes a difference. What is the type of intervention that we're looking at? So we've seen massive changes when it comes to informal, the types of informal work that women are doing. If you start looking at what happened during COVID, you start seeing that women's work really shifted from being in-person, physical, it shifted to online. That had its own sort of challenges. But there are now so many organizations at the community level who are working with women to give them digital literacy, to give them literacy, even when it comes to financial literacy, the organizations working on financial inclusion. Now, the issue with all of this work is, and at least that's what I feel, that it's very, it's in silos and it's taking place at a much smaller level. So we might be thinking that, there's no big change happening. But I'm an optimist, and I think that even with these small incremental changes, you're going to start seeing that there are massive changes that will become evident 20 years from now. And that's actually how norms change, right? They change over a much larger period of time. I think one of the most interesting things that we've seen in the last couple of decades is just how tertiary education, the stats for tertiary education have changed relative to the stats for primary and secondary education. I really like giving the stat, particularly when I teach my students, because we are a highly gender and equal society. When you start looking at our literacy levels, when you start looking at enrollment levels, and you start breaking it down by education levels, you see that gender equality and gender parity, it goes in the opposite direction when you look at tertiary education. So there are more girls enrolled at the tertiary education level than there are boys. At least that's what the aggregate statistics are telling us. And one of the outcomes of more women enrolling at the tertiary education level is it's push back our age of first marriage, because girls are in school longer, so they're not getting married as early. That has an impact on their the age at which they have their first child. Hopefully, this will eventually translate into birth spacing as well. So interventions are happening. They're happening at a small scale level, perhaps, and not perhaps happening at the large scale that we want, or as quickly as they want, when you start looking at the kind of work that particular organizations are doing. Having said all of that, I think there's been some exciting interventions or developments, I should say, at the legal level. So the recognition of home-based workers, the recognition of domestic workers, the kind of labor laws that's passed, the increase in maternity leaves that we've seen in the last couple of months that's happened. Where maternity leave, at least at the federal level, has now been increased up to 6 months. I mean, these are incremental changes which I feel are happening, which could lead to or are expected to lead to major changes when it comes to labor force participation rates. And as labor force participation rates change, that's going to have an impact, we expect, on other aspects of women's lives, other aspects of women's decision making as well.
Thank you so much. Dr. Shabnam, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I admire the optimism and that we have to create our own sunshine. But I worry about the pace, because it is estimated that it'll take, at the pace we are working, it'll take 132 years for us to close the gender gap, and we cannot wait for that. 50% of the population not being optimized is not good for the country, is not good for the families, because women have been, there is evidence that their earnings go more within the family than outside, unlike the males. So it's very important for us to fast track this. It's absolutely correct. And I think that's the game changer for the country. When we say that our youth, and if we talk about demographic dividend, we talk about youth, we are a young, country with 65% of the population under 29 years of age, but that demographic dividend wouldn't happen in itself. And whereas it is the responsibility of the policymakers, but what loss are we incurring by not giving opportunity to, if there are only 22% women in the labor market, more in informal jobs, more in underpaid jobs, the gender pay gap is huge, then they hold more potential to contribute towards the economic growth as compared to men. So who's bringing this conversation to the policy table, So what research is guiding these conversations? What is making a compelling case for us to work towards programs and policies which bring these educated girls into the labor market and exploit economic growth dividend, which is linked to that. There are investment cases that I was able to lead with the World Bank, with UNICEF, on education, what is the education dividend of each year of going to school. And it is much more for girls as compared to boys. What is, again, the impact on GDP as we increase our labor force participation by 10% from the existing 22%, by 25%. And there's no driver better than this, I can tell you, when we were working on the growth strategy for Pakistan. But I think this evidence is something which is really needed. And again, in the format which you can use on to make compelling cases on the social media. We should be using all mediums, writing in, in the newspapers, and also bringing it to the attention of the policymakers so that we are able to create a movement together. As I say, that we cannot wait for 132 years and continue to work on just one wheel, using one wheel of the car. It's not healthy for the country, and the country cannot afford that.
Thank you, Dr. Tandon. Kate, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. So I wanted to narrow in on one specific part of your question, because you were asking about a number of different fields, but I wanted to mention a couple of points specific to labor markets. So we've been doing a lot of work these days on looking at data from our jobs platform, Job Talash, and trying to understand where does the gender gap arise? Like, how much of it comes from the supply side, as in women choosing to work or their families preventing them from working, and how much of it comes from the demand side, that is employers choosing not to recruit women. And one finding that's really come out very, very strikingly from that, from the Lahore data, is that the demand side is real quantitative. Like, both of those things are an issue. Gaps on both sides are an issue for sure, but the demand side, in terms of employer preferences over hiring women versus men, is quantitatively really, really dramatically larger. That starts to, so you see, for one thing, a lot of vacancies that are posted where the employers just say, we're not going to consider female applicants. And then if they see female candidate CVs, even with the exact same characteristics, they're less likely to choose them for an interview. So that's the exciting thing, is that gap starts to close a lot as education levels go up. So that's a really promising kind of feature of this. The other piece that I wanted to highlight here is that there's a lot of evidence from other countries in the region that suggests that more growth in specific sectors on the demand side that tend to hire women. So things like garments, things like business process outsourcing, basically more demand for female labor leads to changes in terms of women in girls' education and women entering the labor force. And so there's just a lot kind of going on in terms of the demand side and the firm side that there's potential for policy to influence. One final thing that comes out of the analysis that we've been doing with the Lahore data that surprised me a lot is that the variation, because given that we know from other settings that certain industries and certain types of occupations tend to be more friendly to women, more likely to be open to female candidates, I was surprised to see how much that varies even within the same industry, within the same occupation. So you see firms that are in the same, doing the same kind of work in the same city, and some of them are open to hiring women and others are not. So I think a big area for kind of more understanding in the future is what is it that drives those variations from firm to firm, and what kinds of policy interventions might be relevant to help nudge more firms over that barrier to kind of considering female applicants. If more of that happens, then I think you also are likely to see the supply side respond too. So women, there's a lot of women we see repeatedly in various different kinds of data sources who aren't working, aren't searching, but then they're interested potentially in taking up employment if they find something good. They're just not searching because they know there's nothing out there for them. So I'd really love to see kind of more work happening on the labor demand side in the future, both from a research and a policy.
Absolutely. So I want to, so one thing that Dr. Shabnam mentioned about engagement with policymakers. So I want to discuss that question more, and drawing from your experiences, what do you think are like effective ways of marketing research ideas or findings that we have, or findings that we have from interventions that could be of interest to policymakers?
Okay. From my experience, a lot of time the research which was brought to us was in the final shape. I feel for the policymakers to use it, the research should start from the policymakers' desk. What is the evidence that they are requiring? What do they need it for? What policy change or what program priority is something which the government is thinking of, and what evidence would help them in moving forward, in making the right investments, in bringing in change where they see that there's a block or limited understanding around it. So if that happens, then the policymakers would be keen and would be following you up that when is that evidence coming, because that is going to help guide the investment that they have to make. So just to give you an example, when I was working for the government of Punjab prior to the Planning Commission, and there was a health survey that we used to conduct, which was around 4 indicators, and we would get information on maternal institutional deliveries, on immunization rates, skilled birth attendance. So the report got delayed at my desk because we had outsourced it, but we weren't happy, and we tried to play with the data at the team that I was leading. And there was a complaint which was made by the secretary to the chief minister that I am not getting the evidence which I need from this report, because I need to prioritize on the districts where I need to invest more resources to improve the skilled birth attendance or the immunization rates. And I think that was music to my ears, because that is the sort of relationship that we want from the policymakers, that they wait for your evidence and they use that evidence to make the investments where they are needed the most. And in a country like Pakistan, where we have limited budgets for education, for any programs or in any sector, it is very important to have that evidence guiding us to where we need to invest and why we need to invest, what's going to be the impact of this investment. So that is how I see the connection between the policymakers and the academicians and the researchers.
If Dr. Hadia or Kate want to add about their experiences in engaging with policymakers on gender-related matters, how have they tackled or also generated an interest in their work when presenting findings or policy interventions to policymakers?
I can add something, Nadaru. So for me, perhaps 2 strategies have worked, and here I do want to echo what Dr. Shabnam has said. I think one effective strategy has been having the government partner collaborator on board from the start. And in that, I think grant bodies have actually do encourage that a lot more today. So making sure that the research that you're doing, it translates into policy is something that I think everyone's interested in. And as a development economist, for me, my training, my sort of bend has always been, okay, what is the policy angle to this? So having that government partner on board, having those conversations with those government partners, when you're even just framing your research question or thinking about what area that you're interested in looking at, that's really important. Secondly, I mean, just dissemination, I think is really, so the kind of conversation that we're having today, that there are researchers, there's a policy think tank, there is a government arm as well represented in a panel. I think this is so important. So it's important to have these conversations, it's important to write. I inevitably have someone or the other from the policy arena reaching out most times after I've written an op-ed, for example. So it's really heartening to see that there's so much interest in evidence-based policy today. And there is now a greater, I should say, need or a greater push from the government side as well, from the policymaker side as well. You know what, whatever policy intervention we're thinking about, whatever plan we want to deploy, or whatever intervention we want to make, we like it to be grounded in evidence. We like to have that understanding coming from academia. So I think the appetite is there, and I think that actors on both sides are willing to talk to each other. We just need to talk to each other more. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add, I agree completely with everything that's been said. I think one of the big challenges can be kind of incompatibility of timelines, especially with certain kinds of impact evaluation research. So often, you know, policy partners are interested in getting answers on a much shorter time frame than it takes to produce them with impact evaluation methodology. And I think one of the things that's been most important in my work in trying to kind of help to address that problem has been, as has been said already, engaging early and often, but also producing a lot of interim outputs that are kind of responsive to what policymakers are trying to learn. So I found on a number of kind of big projects with public or quasi-public partners in Pakistan that very early, like much earlier on than the final kind of RCT output or final analysis or paper that we would be writing, that baseline reports that really dig very carefully into the data and just describe them can be very useful. So to give a small example, we collaborated with the Punjab Commission on the Status of Women on an evaluation of marriage registrars training, which they rolled out in collaboration with the local government department across a large part of Punjab. And while we were still in the process of collecting and analyzing follow-up data, we did analysis of baseline data, like data from within the training and data from just from the listing of registrars that was collected as a part of that project to document some really simple facts. So one of those facts was a really large fraction of the registrars had no formal education or very low levels of formal education, like primary or middle school, had no madrasa training either, and did very poorly on baseline tests of their knowledge of the laws that they themselves are supposed to be enforcing. So that's a very simple thing to document. That's something that we can do with a simple descriptive statistic, but it turned out to be very useful for the commission in helping to kind of support the case for continuing and expanding the training and advocating for other kinds of policy changes as well. So I think it people who are kind of more in a research space often think about like a single final end product. And as Dr. Shabnam has been pointing out also in both verbally and in the comments, that the end, I liked what you wrote here, that, you know, our endpoint isn't a final paper or publication. Our endpoint is policy change. The way that researchers can help to contribute to that is by producing like tailored outputs that are not necessarily the same as what the final academic research output is. They can complement.
Yeah, thank you. So before we open the floor for questions, I just have one last question. So I think this relates back to something that Kate mentioned earlier about thinking of potential negative consequences or sometimes unintended consequences that we might have with gender-related research. So my question is that how can our work be more sensitive to gender-related negative consequences that might be a product of policy interventions or might be a product of research interventions. For example, women might face resistance at home due to, say, increased family planning, or they might even face violence in certain cases. So when thinking about working with women, what are ways in which you anticipate some of these consequences and try to overcome them? I think anyone who wants to go first can answer this question.
I can jump in on this. So I think that there's a number, this is a really, really important issue, the potential for backlash to of various different kinds or unintended negative consequences to interventions that are intended to be gender empowering. So I think one piece of the picture is to try to think about not just who stands to gain, but also who stands to lose and what do they stand to lose when thinking about an intervention. So in our ongoing work on women's rights to inheritance in Punjab, so we're looking at the rollout of a digitization program that happened in the Land Records Administration. So that meant that instead of people working just at the village level with the Patwari, the local revenue officer, to kind of update land records when somebody passed away and it's passed to the heirs, instead it's now more formalized, and there's a digital system that requires a visit to an office that also has female staff and verifies that all of the heirs are present. So one of the benefits of that system was put into place for a number of reasons. It has had a number of documented benefits, including improved functioning of agricultural land markets. One of the benefits that we're seeing of that is that there's a very clear impact of that new system on increasing women's access to inheriting land. So that's really great. Unfortunately, it does seem like there's also some unintended negative consequences in the form of women, the women who are being affected by this getting married younger, having children younger, and having less consent in the choice of their spouse. So the work that we're doing right now is trying to dig more into why that's the case. There's a number of possible reasons why that might happen. One is that maybe families are trying to keep land in the family, so to speak, or keep land in the male line by marrying their daughters off to somebody that they think won't contest the inheritance. Another possibility is that because the land is now being split up, that means that there's the parents are kind of compensating by reducing the dowry that the daughter gets, and then that means that she doesn't get, it changes the possible marriage opportunities available to her. So that's work in progress, but it does seem pretty clear that there's some degree of unintended negative consequences that are accompanying the positive consequence of women having access to property rights. So why do I say that we should be thinking about kind of who has the possibility of losing out? Well, land is not an ever expanding pie. Land is a fixed amount, and if it gets divided up, that means a daughter might gain and a son might lose. And so we should be thinking ahead when kind of thinking about this sort of thing, that what are some of the possible ways that families might respond to the fact that the sons might be losing out? Either the sons themselves, or maybe the parents are going to do something such as adjusting their plans for dowry and the marriage plans for their daughters that might in some way compensate for that. So, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing these things. It is a kind of a difficult welfare analysis to do, since there's some positive and some negative consequences to this change. But it is something that we should be thinking about carefully as we sort of think about the gender implications of this sort of policy change and intervention.
Thank you so much. I think we can open up the floor for questions. So we already have a lot of questions. Thank you, Dr. Shabnam, for answering most of the questions in the Q&A section. So one question, I think you can answer this right now. Vakar has asked, how is the M&E of the social sector projects at Planning Commission generating evidence? What are the gaps in the M&E processes, and how can it be improved?
So the M&E which happens, at the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission is at the federal level, but we have planning and development departments which are at the provincial level. So they carry out the same function. They review the proposals which come to them, and once they have approved them, then they allocate the monies, and for the later half of the year, they would be monitoring on quarterly basis. We hold stock takes and we monitor the projects. However, the monitoring in the government is largely focused on budget utilization. So how much budget was given to the project and how much has been utilized. As a technocrat, my argument always had been that you may be utilizing the entire budget, but still see no change on the ground. So budget utilization is a very narrow lens with which we do the monitoring. However, we were able to bring in some shifts and trying to identify some critical milestones for every project, and also trying to identify where we are with in terms of the SDG, what contribution is being made towards the SDG by each of the project, and trying to monitor that as well. It's very important to have the baselines, and that's why we invested heavily over the last few years into creating these dashboards, which are district specific, and we would do them for education, we would do them for employment, we would do them for different health indicators in order to pick up on the evidence to help us guide where to do the investments, and also encourage the provinces that these are the baselines that you have for each of the districts. So come back to us and let us know that how you would be closing this gap in education, how would you be closing this gap in labor force participation, what targets would you set up for yourself, and what support would you need from the Federal Planning Commission in this context. And the same, I think, was done with the bilaterals and multilaterals. And so that when you have the baselines, because you'll be surprised to know, whereas at many forums we hear that we do not have gender disaggregated data, but at the Planning Commission, we had gender disaggregated data by age for every district, for girls and boys who were out of school, and they were also geotagged. So if you have that level of micro information available, then for any partner or any public-private sector organization to work in any district can easily show the impact. And it's so having these baselines is very critical. There is a long way to go, but I think there is a lot of appetite in the public sector, and lots of forums for stock takes have now become robust over the 6.5 years that I worked with the government. And that has helped us bring the transformation in some of the indicators, because Pakistan is not a small country. With a population now of 249 to 250 million being quoted with the recent census, the denominator is huge. So showing a change in the skilled birth attendance or immunization in a province like Punjab is not a small feat. So I think we do have some fantastic examples of now having but certainly these are things that we need to have in every sector and for every program. Again, the technocrats and the experts who are in academia, research institutions can help us build that. What indicators can we be following up for family planning? What should every organization be reporting back on? How can we establish baselines where we don't have baselines? And again, I think one is for the baselines and also for the investment cases. Why should we be investing in certain areas? So, and what impact is it likely to create? Because that also helps build a very compelling narrative for policymakers, in front of policymakers when we want some decisions in a particular line.
Absolutely. So one question that Nadia had that Dr. Shabnam had answered in the chat, but I'd like to actually open it up for other panelists as well. Nadia is saying, wouldn't empowering women be more important than creating equal employment opportunities in our local context?
If I can take a stab at this, and actually I think Ms. Nadia had another question as well, and I think they're interlinked. So I mean, one, empowerment is, if you think about it, it's creating choices or the ability to exercise choices where previously you couldn't. And access to monetary resources, which is what employment provides, is and it has been shown to be an important means by which women can exercise choices where previously they couldn't, and just expanding the set of choices that women have as well. So it goes hand in hand. If you want to empower women, you have to think about the kind of employment that they have available. And in this, I think we have to be mindful that, and if this goes back to something that Dr. Shabnam had said earlier, what is the nature of the employment that they're doing? Where are they working? There's certain types of employment which have a much higher empowering potential than other types of employment does. So, and where they're working, whether they're working inside the home, whether they're working outside the home, that has a major impact on the kind of choices they're making or the gamut of choices that they have available. Now, in all of this, I think it's really important for us to keep in mind the local context that Ms. Nadia is talking about and the kind of roles that we have for men and women. So in our local context, in our cultural context, gender roles are much more strictly defined. Men are supposed to be engaged in productive work and women are supposed to be engaged in reproductive work. And I think when we talk about expanding employment opportunities, we cannot ignore the fact that even when women are engaging in productive work, they continue to bear the burden of reproductive work, which ends up really impoverishing them from a time perspective. So because the burden on women just increases manifold. So if we want to have really significant impact on women's well-being, not just from do they have access to monetary resources, but the sense of self that they have, we really have to start thinking about the gender roles that are there. I mean, we have a lot of emphasis on men being able to financially provide for the entire family, and that puts men under a lot of stress. We have a lot of emphasis on women taking care of children and taking care of their house, and when they're working, it puts them under a lot of stress. So to my mind, at least, in order to really transform our society, we have to become a little bit more flexible. I think we need to empower men to be able to do reproductive work, because there are a lot of men who would like to do this, but they can't. There's just not that level of flexibility at their place of work. There's just not that level of understanding within even perhaps their household or with the sense of self that they have. And we have to become a lot more understanding when it comes to the kind of roles that women have. So I would say that we need a balance for both men and women, so that these opportunities to engage in different types of work become available to larger portions of our population. And I think once you become more flexible and there can be a bit more balance in terms of the types of roles that men and women have, then the pressure on women to stay at home, to take care of their family would ease, and that would perhaps open the gamut of employment opportunities they have available. So one of the reasons why women engage in informal work and work from home, where maybe employment is not as gainful, is because they have to remain flexible and they have to take care of their family at the same time. And that keeps women constrained. So if you just start opening things up a little bit, I think that it'll improve the potential for empowerment for both genders.
Absolutely. So one final question, we're almost out of time as well. I guess we can close on this question. And I think Dr. Hadia answered for the most part this question. So Nadia had another question. How can men contribute to women's empowerment? We do not have much scientific evidence on that. Any of the panelists would like to have?
Yeah, there is, we cannot progress unless first thing is that we have to convince men at the moment, because they make the majority. And the second thing is that if we look at any of, there is a lot of research which is available. You cannot do this alone, and you wouldn't be able to, be successful without engaging with men. We are in it together, and we'll always be in it together. If we are at home, we want to see more girls going to school. And of course, unless and until their fathers, their brothers are not more supportive, they wouldn't be able to do that. The early marriages is again something that, the mother has to convince the father. So that negotiation and that conversation is again very important. When you getting into the employment again, convincing the huge, it's the majority of the interview panels are males. Again, when you get into, we did a research in at the federal ministries across 103 federal ministries and their offices, and the total number of women officers is 11%. So there is a large portion or a majority, there's a large percentage which clears the CSS exams and all. But if you look at the ones who are in employment, it's far less. So we need male allies within these sectors to help encourage women not only to be inducted and recruited, but also particularly to be advancing in their careers. So if I look at my career trajectory, I wouldn't have been where I am without my father giving me the same opportunity to get into the higher educational institution that I went to together with my brother. My husband supporting me to do the jobs that I was able to do despite having 3 children, who were very young. I had twins after a daughter who was 1.5. And then again, when I was advancing in my career, some of the senior colleagues who helped me and to open up opportunities for me to bring visibility to the sort of work that I was doing and was capable to do. And they are my go-to people to get any sort of advice. So building those relationships within your own personal network, I call that as my kitchen cabinet. And I have a lot of men, starting from my father, my husband, my colleagues, who I can go to for advice and for troubleshooting whenever I'm, challenged, and we all are. So we just cannot do it without them. And this is not a war that is against the men. It is something that we want to be given to women as well, and that's why we call for gender. It's not something we are going to take away from them. It's something which is not being given to women, and they deserve it, and they deserve to be treated equally, and they deserve, and again, from a policy perspective, a narrative that I carry is that it is a win-win for everybody. It is a win-win for the men in the family. It is a win-win for the country. It is a win-win globally for if women are given equal chances to contribute to economic growth. So not without men, absolutely.
Thank you so much, everyone. So we are out of time, so I'm just going to wrap up the session. I want to thank all our panelists for taking out the time and having such a thoughtful, wonderful discussion. Also want to thank all the attendees for their thoughtful questions. And yes, thank you, everyone. Take care. Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
If there's a poll at the end for the participants, can you please do the poll? It would really help a lot, the organizers, in terms of organizing the session. So it's just a very short poll. It will take you a minute. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chandan.